Welcome back, friends. Tonight's story is The Open Window by H. Munro, or Saki. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttel," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttel endeavoured to say the correct something, which should duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people around here?" asked the niece, when she judged they had had sufficient silent communion. "Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, you know, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That would be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" "Out through that window, 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe-shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back some day. They and that little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing 'Birdie, why do you bound,' as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for a snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that she should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and an avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement, he continued. No, said Mrs. Sappleton in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Here they are at last, she cried, just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes? Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window, with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the windows. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, I said, Bertie, why do you bound? Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was it that bolted out as we came up? A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttel, said Mrs. Sappleton. Could only talk about his illnesses, and then dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. I expected it was the spaniel, said the niece, calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose his nerve. Romance at short notice was her specialty. The end. So, H. Munro, or Saki. Why did he call himself Saki? Apparently, it was a part of a very famous translation of Persian texts, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. It was translated in the 1850s or so, and in the Romantic era, it was very well thought of, and everyone loved it, and apparently Saki is in there somewhere, where I was unable to ascertain. There are a few different theories on that, but that seems to be the predominant one, that it came from this specific book of translations. The Open Window was initially published as a short story in 1911 in the Westminster Gazette, and then later it was compiled into a group of short stories in a book by Saki called Beasts and Super Beasts. There's a hyphen in there. I don't know if I said Super Beasts, like Spider-Man. How do you say a hyphen? I don't know. The story itself is very straightforward. It's worth I'm not fishing for views or anything, but it's worth a second look, because once you know the twist at the end, all of the niece's actions going up to the end are suddenly much clearer. And Saki actually, throughout the initial part of the book, he kind of drops hints and says Frampton thought that it was there was a masculine presence here, but clearly a man lives here. Or did he die 3 years ago? Bum, bum, bum. This story is just very entertaining. It's kind of a masterclass in how to build suspense. You have the niece pulling this yarn of and he had the coat and there was the dog with him, and just setting the stage and doing all of these details that eventually pay off. I always link, the author's bio and some information down in the video description box, but in particular, I will link the song Bertie, Why Do You Bound? Because it is a very, very early one. I found a recording that's on a wax cylinder kind of thing, so she knows what they look like. She knows what they looked like when they went out that very morning. And she knows what they're going to look like when they come back, so she can describe them to a T. It has a very excellent economy of words. It's a very, as you might be able to tell, it's a very short story, which I intentionally did this one, not only because it's really good, but also because I have a little bit of the sniffles. I don't know if you can tell by this, by the sound of my voice, but I have a little bit of the sniffles, so I wanted to keep it kind of short and sweet this week. So that's part of why I went with it, but also it kind of showcases what a masterful command he has of language and how he uses just every word to craft this story. And the way it's written has kind of a very specific cadence too. Like when the niece is telling him the story, it just kind of very slowly unfolds. And then it gets even slower and slower as he sees them out the window, and then he starts running. At that point, it's very like choppy. The drive, gravel fence, oh my god, and he runs into it. It's just very, very quick at that point too, which is really kind of interesting as, you know, like a writer, just to see how the sentence structure can also affect your feeling as you're reading the story too, because at that point you don't know yet either, so you're just as panicked and ready to run as he is. I hope you enjoyed The Open Window. If you did, make sure to give me a thumbs up down below so that I know that you liked it. And while you're down there, you might as well subscribe so you don't miss next week's short story. I'll see you guys next week.